Chapter 18 Casualties of War. Even though the Soviet Union collapsed on the 15th of December, the war carried on for 7 more days. That's how long it took for the new Russian Federation to assert control over the former Red Army and negotiate a real ceasefire with Japan and their allies. In that time, Russian forces skirmished back and forth with the Japanese and Americans. Neither side had any real goals that I remembered. We were just trying to give each other one last black eye before the war truly ended. Right here. After the shootout on Surumi Bridge, Chihiro was transported to Chudan Hospital in Naka Ward, south of the Peace Park and deep in Japanese-held Hiroshima. I stayed with her partly out of a stubborn refusal to leave her side and partly because I was in no fit state to be fighting. The act of donating blood had put me down for the count. Even though help arrived quickly, Chihiro still lost roughly 35% of all the blood in her body before medics could stabilize her. As soon as I stepped up, Japanese medics drew so much of my blood that I felt woozy and had to sit down. That's why we were both hospitalized. Meanwhile, the end of the war hit the rest of the world like a ton of bricks. The new Russian Federation overthrew the last holdouts of the Soviet Union rather violently, trying to lock down and secure Russia before NATO forces could arrive in Moscow. When Vladimir Putin officially took over from Irisha Kimoto, a combined force of British, French, German, and Polish troops were close enough to see the Moscow skyline on the horizon. In Korea, the Chinese army finally reached Pyongyang and restored the Kim dynasty to power, but compared with the destruction of the USSR, splitting Korea in half for a second time was a very hollow victory. The Soviet force surrounding Hiroshima seemed to disintegrate over the next few days. Thousands of enemy soldiers simply put down their weapons and deserted, walking back to Obama or Totori and commandeering the landing ships so they could return home. We captured so many Soviet weapons and vehicles this way that we didn't know what to do with them all. On top of that, nearly 1,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered to us. Many of them brought Japanese POWs with them and released them back to us. Then, everything came to a head in the early hours of Kotori Sato's 20th birthday. December 21st, 2012. The Sea of Japan. 6 people met aboard a Korean cruiser off the coast of Niigata to negotiate an end to the hostilities. 2 Japanese, 1 American, and 3 Russians. Because General Laura Harper was busy fighting in Hiroshima, she appointed a junior grade officer from the U.S. Army to act on her behalf. John Bradford is remembered fondly by history. He was the central officer of XCOM under Laura Harper during the Second Hyperspace War, and eventually became its second commander. He led our world to victory during the War in Heaven and is rightly memorialized as one of mankind's greatest champions. But on this cold winter morning, he was the man authorized by the United States to deliver our demands. The armistice was, publicly, a negotiated agreement between Russia, Japan, and the United States to stop fighting. In reality, it was a thinly veiled surrender demand. The Russians were in no condition to dispute or renegotiate any of the terms. Their only option was to sign the document or have a less favorable peace forced upon them. General Artyom Sidorov met the Allied representatives in the captain's quarters and signed the armistice without a word. Then he pulled out his cell phone and showed it to Bradford. The American officer produced his own cell phone, and they synchronized their clocks. As agreed, the war will end today at 11:59 p.m. Tokyo time, Sidorov declared. You have my word, Bradford promised, straight from General Harper, Prime Minister Nakagawa, President Robinson, and President-elect Alexander. All hostilities will stop at midnight. 6 hours until the ceasefire. Chuden Hospital, Naka Ward. The war ends at midnight, Holly Smith declared as Chihiro and I left the hospital and met our comrades in the parking lot. It's official. When did the word come down? I asked. Not 30 minutes ago, Soylent told us. The new Russian leader, Putin, and the Japanese Prime Minister worked out an agreement earlier today. So Nakagawa was actually good for something, huh? Chihiro mused. That means we only have to stay alive until 11:59 tonight, Holly concluded. That should be easy, Aaron laughed. Most of the Russians have left or surrendered. There's just a few stubborn holdouts left now. Kotori and Chihiro gave one another a long hug. They were both relieved that the fight was finally over. So what are we going to do until then? Chihiro asked. General Harper wants us to do one last combat patrol, Holly explained. Like Ray said, there are some holdouts who want to keep scrapping up right until the clock runs out. Were you two cleared for combat duty? We're clear, I said. Good, Soylent replied. I was starting to worry about Endo's mental health. She's been cleaning your weapons and helmets every day since Surumi. Sure enough, when our little team walked back to our Humvees, we found Tsubaki sitting cross-legged on the ground, my own rifle disassembled in front of her as she cleaned each piece of it carefully with a toothbrush. When she saw us, the 12-year-old child soldier sprang up and hugged me, squealing. Oh my gosh! Did you really give your blood to Tachibana-kun and save her life? Without waiting for an answer, Tsubaki ran over to Chihiro and bear-hugged her so hard that both girls fell to the ground, prompting everyone else to laugh. Are you gonna marry him? Tsubaki asked. If you won't, I will. You two are so perfect. I reassembled my weapon and grabbed Chihiro's helmet, offering it to her. I'm not gonna lie, Endo. I'm actually gonna miss you when this is all over. Let's go watch the end of a war. 4 hours until the ceasefire. Our squad patrolled on foot, moving around the perimeter where Japanese-held Hiroshima met the Russian-occupied city. Chihiro, Tsubaki, Holly, Soylent, Kotori, Aaron, and I all patrolled on foot, while Hal McIntosh and Nanako Yamada brought up the rear, driving one of our Humvees. Nanako was in the gunner's seat, but she had taken both hands off the weapon. By the time we reached the ruins of an English school, word was spreading quickly about the ceasefire. Nobody was interested in fighting anymore. Most of the enemy had either deserted or surrendered, and the few Russians remaining on the battle line simply nodded in acknowledgement as we walked by. A few Soviets surrendered to us, and those of us on foot had to wait while Nanako loaded them into the Humvee and drove the new prisoners back to base and came back. During these lulls, we all talked about our plans for after the war. I'm going back down under, Soylent told us. I want to reopen my bar. You can all come down if you like. Drinks will be on me. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself, Holly confessed. My flat's empty, I buried my husband, and I've got no kids. Just wing it, Aaron suggested. That's what I'm going to do anyway. Hey there, Ray. Whereabouts in America are you planning to wing it? Kotori asked. Just curious. I live in Minnesota, Aaron replied. Probably the coldest, most wintry place in America besides Alaska. I really miss ice fishing and hunting. Well, you know, I'm from Hokkaido. Kotori bumped his shoulder with hers. We get severe winters, too. I know my way around a frozen lake. 3 hours until the ceasefire. A few hours after sundown, every soldier in Japan, be they American, Russian, Japanese, British, Australian, or French, or something else, received an automated text message on their smartphones, provided they had a working one, of course. Supreme Allied Command warned us that the war would end at 11:59 p.m., and we were expected to stop all hostilities at that time. No sooner had the message gone out than a Soviet soldier got up from his fighting position and walked into the middle of the main boulevard. He faced towards our squad, took off his helmet, and bowed to us, before turning around and walking away. 2 hours and 30 minutes until the ceasefire. We arrived in the Hondori shopping district, a 2-mile stretch of pedestrian walkways covered by a massive canopy and bordered by shops on all sides. The place looked like an absolute ruin. It had been thoroughly looted by the Russians before we got there, but we did find some people there. A Japanese soldier was running through the place, spreading the word about the ceasefire to anyone who didn't have a working cell phone. At this stage of the war, there were a lot. "Senso wa Owata!" the man yelled. The war is over. We had to wait for Hal and Nanako to get the Humvee through all of the wreckage before we could move on. In that time, a local family passed us by. An old man and a woman were carrying 2 small children on their backs, and they greeted us quietly. "Are you finally going home?" Kotori asked. The old man pointed to the burned-out skeleton of what had once been an apartment complex. "That is our home," he said. "We are going to my wife's sister. She may have room for us." A few minutes later, the Humvee got unstuck, and we pressed on. We came to a crater in the ground on a street corner. Chihiro, Nanako, and Kotori sifted through the rubble, looking for any identifying information. "This used to be a Tiffany's jewelry store," Nanako said, holding up a ruined sign. "Looted and blown up by the Russians." "What makes you think that?" Aaron asked. "Because the Russians are right there." Kotori pointed over his shoulder. 3 Soviet soldiers were sitting inside what used to be a convenience store on the far side of the street. They were rifling through what little food remained and stuffing their faces. All of their pockets were filled with jewelry, probably worth hundreds of millions of yen. At Nanako's words, one of the men looked around and spotted us. He patted the side of his rifle with one hand and gave us an inquisitive look. We all shook our heads and waved our hands, letting him know we didn't want to fight. Aaron, Kotori, Chihiro, and I crossed the street and spoke to our soon-to-be former enemies. While I did not ask their names in that moment, I did find out several years later that the man who looked up and saw us was Alexei Volobyov, the Soviet paratrooper who landed at Kotori's school when the war began 6 years ago. "Which unit were you with?" Alexei asked me. "I started out in the 369th Signal Battalion," I replied. "Now I'm with the 13th Artillery. You?" 83rd Guards Air Assault Brigade. We're from Ussurisk, not far from Vladivostok." "What about you?" Alexei turned to Kotori. "You look like you're from Hokkaido." "Good guess," she said. "I lived in Sapporo when you and your friends invaded." Alexei offered Kotori a flask, and she took a long drink of something that smelled like whiskey. "Figured," Alexei said. "I thought you looked a little familiar. I was one of the first on the ground in Sapporo when all this started." "I'm sure we crossed paths once or twice," Kotori said. She took another big swig from Alexei's flask and passed it to him. Her eyes narrowed. "Where were you?" Chihiro asked, gesturing around the ruined city. "Up by the Mazda Stadium," Alexei replied. "Lots of young men and women over there, lost out on what could have been good lives. Some wore the Red Star, and some wore the Rising Sun." The other 2 Soviets produced cans of beer and passed them around to us. Everybody took a drink to the fallen. "Seen enough of this war?" I asked. "Absolutely," Alexei replied. "Me too," Aaron and Kotori sighed together. As we gathered up our things and prepared to leave, I turned back to Alexei and said, "Don't let any of our friends see you carrying all that jewelry away." Alexei looked down and saw millions of yen's worth of gold and gemstones were visible in his backpack. He closed the flap, then raised his arm and gave us a salute. "See you in hell, imperialist pig." "See you in hell, commie bastard." 90 minutes until the ceasefire. We left Alexei and his squadmates behind, patrolling north towards the ruins of Hiroshima Castle until we hit the electric railway line. Then we turned west and started turning towards Ioi Bridge and the atomic dome. "Hey, Chi," I said, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. "I've got an idea." "About what?" she asked. "About how we're going to live after the war," I said. "I've got about a year's worth of military paychecks built up. We can probably support each other for a couple of years at least. That should be plenty of time to find some kind of work." Chihiro smacked herself in the forehead. "I'm so stupid," she declared. "I dropped out of school to join up. I'll have to go to a cramming school and get my GED before I get a job anywhere." Chihiro was struck by another realization and said, "Oh, Blake, I'm so sorry. That means you'll have to do the breadwinning for us. Sorry for making you support me like that." "Aw, listen to you two," Kotori teased. "You sound like you're already married." Chihiro blushed and then fell silent. But after a few minutes, I whispered in her ear, "You know, Chi, if you asked me to marry you, I'd say yes. Or were you waiting for me to ask?" Chihiro was blushing so intensely I thought her helmet was going to catch fire. A moment later, she whispered back, "One condition, I get to pick the venue. There's this beautiful place in Miyazaki." She trailed away, lost in some wistful fantasy. "Done deal," I answered, and we hugged one another. 30 minutes until the ceasefire. We finally reached the end of our patrol route, and I couldn't think of a more poetic way for the war to end. It was 30 minutes to midnight, the city was dark and quiet, and it had just started snowing. Our patrol route terminated at the eastern edge of the Ioi Bridge, a T-shaped structure that connected 3 islands together right in the very core of the city. We could look across the river and see the northern edge of the Peace Park, complete with the solemn memorials to the victims of the 1945 attack. Kotori warned us to avoid setting foot on the bridge, as it was heavily laden with landmines. So instead, we parked on the far side of the road and took the rest of our time to admire the atomic dome, marveling the fact that it had now survived 2 world wars. Aaron and Kotori sat by the riverbank together, talking about something I never found out. Hal fell asleep in the driver's seat of our Humvee, while Tsubaki and Nanako gossiped together in Japanese. Holly, Soylent, Chihiro, and I all gathered together in the middle of the street, watching the final half hour of the war tick away on Holly's smartphone. 15 minutes until the ceasefire. Around 1:45 2 Soviet soldiers approached us and offered to surrender. Nanako and Hal loaded them into the back seat of the Humvee and drove away. Before they left, Hal reminded us what radio frequency we could call him on. "I should only be about 15 minutes, he said. "Hopefully, nothing will happen before I get back." 10 minutes until the ceasefire. Relieved to have survived and happy to be with each other again, Chihiro and I shared a kiss in the moonlight while snowflakes fluttered around us. 5 minutes until the ceasefire. Aaron, Kotori, Holly, Soylent, Chihiro, and I swapped contact information and set up an online group so we could stay in contact after we parted ways. On Kotori's suggestion, we called ourselves the Stormbreakers. 3 minutes until the ceasefire. With extreme reluctance, we added Tsubaki to the group. 1 minute until the end of the war. The pounding of footsteps and a strangled yell reached our ears. The 7 of us looked around and saw 2 people running down the main road towards us. They were both wearing Soviet Army uniforms. One of them, a man, was shouting to a woman. He was commanding her to stop, to come back. The woman, however, was ignoring him. She continued charging towards our position, raising a submachine gun and firing in our direction. As bullets snapped and popped over our heads, I pushed Tsubaki and yelled, "Back up! Get back!" The clouds parted and moonlight fell onto the scene. To our pure, genuine horror, we realized that the woman charging at us was somebody we knew. It was Yukiko Takahashi. "Stop!" Holly shouted. "Don't do it!" Yukiko took aim and fired another burst. 7 or 8 bullets zipped by us so close I could feel them cutting through the air. Kotori, Chihiro, Aaron, and I all raised our rifles and took aim at the incoming traitor. Soylent Green turned up the brightness on his cell phone and raised it above his head so Yukiko could see the digital clock on the screen. 12 a.m. "Stop!" Soylent yelled. "It's over! The war is over! The war is over!" "Yameru! Senso wa owata!" Chihiro and Kotori screamed in Japanese. "Yameru! Yameru!" Yukiko was about 50 feet away, and I could see her face. There was a crazed, psychotic look in her eyes that told me in an instant that she couldn't be reasoned with. I unholstered my pistol, took aim, and fired. I hit Yukiko 3 times in the chest, just above her heart. She crumpled to the ground and lay there, twitching and convulsing. Soylent, Kotori, and Aaron ran toward the spot where Yukiko had fallen, while Holly called Hal and Nanako on the radio. "Macintosh, you'd better bring some medics back with you. A whole ambulance if you—" Holly never finished her sentence. At that exact moment, a blast ripped through the area. The concussive wave deafened us. A flash of light and heat hit me and caused me to recoil. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Tsubaki crumple and vanish into a cloud of dust. Dirt and asphalt and chunks of concrete rained down on us. Chihiro was blown off her feet and dazed. Holly took one look at the spot where Tsubaki fell and screamed into the radio, "Medical emergency! Get medics over here right now!" I lurched forward. At the moment, I was forcing myself into action because standing still was making me feel sick. I ran over to the point where Tsubaki had fallen. The first thing I saw was that both of her legs were amputated, blown off at the knees. Then I realized where we were. Tsubaki had wandered onto Aioi Bridge. She stepped on a landmine. That was all the thinking I could do in that specific moment. Tsubaki wasn't processing what had just happened. Not only were her legs gone, but she was also bleeding from shrapnel wounds in her arms and chest. I patted down Tsubaki's uniform and found her personal first aid kit. I was trying to put a tourniquet on her left leg when Chihiro and Kotori joined me. "Sato!" I gasped. "What kind of mine was that?" "It was a blast mine." Kotori gasped while treating Tsubaki's injuries with gauze and medical tape. "They're supposed to injure, not kill." "Well, good fucking job," Chihiro snarled. "Open your first aid kit and give me another tourniquet." We worked on Tsubaki for about 3 minutes. We tied 4 tourniquets around her legs and wrapped up her wounds as best we could. All the while, we took it in 30-second shifts to talk to Tsubaki and tell her she was going to be okay. Finally, we heard a squealing of tires and revving of engines. A Humvee and a military ambulance had arrived. Hal and Nanako took Tsubaki in a stretcher and loaded her into the back of the ambulance next to Yukiko. Only once Tsubaki was in the care of the American medics did we finally relax. Chihiro broke down. "She's just a kid," Chihiro cried. "This isn't right. This isn't fair." Kotori and I put our arms around Chihiro, and we all slumped down, sitting on the curb. We were cold, tired, covered in blood and gunpowder, and wishing the past few minutes had never happened at all. As the ambulance sped away, we were left in silence for just a few moments before a new noise reached our ears. Through the gentle pitter-patter of snow hitting the ground, a great roar, unlike anything we'd heard so far, was going up in the city. Hundreds of thousands of people were cheering, celebrating, for the clock had gone past midnight. It was December 22nd, 2012. The war was over. The sun rose on a completely different world. I imagine that this would have been a fascinating and interesting world to live in, to see how future generations would live and work in the aftermath of this war would make for an incredible alternate history project. But just that, alternate history. This brave new world, forged in the fires of one of the greatest wars humankind has ever known, would only live for 3 years before it was snuffed out. After 6 years of fighting, the largest and most powerful nation on Earth was reduced to a rump of its former self. Any Soviet leader who was remotely involved in the war was arrested and tried by either the Japanese or the new Russian Federation. Arisha Kimoto, the former Soviet president, would remain under house arrest until the fall of Earth 3 years later. A great deal of the testimony she submitted to the UNGTRC was used in the creation of this book. Not only did the Soviet Union collapse, but the so-called People's Republic disintegrated as well. Tragically, the Japanese would not be able to fully reassert their control over Hokkaido before history took a sharp turn. Prime Minister Ryo Nakagawa would have his hands full for years with the reconstruction effort, which was severely hampered by the fact that the closest friendly country, Korea, had been cut in half again by China. Our enemies found themselves scattered without a nation to call their own. Rafal Kowalski, one of Arisha Kimoto's co-conspirators, was deported to his home country of Poland, where he was less than welcome following the collapse of communism. He would join XCOM in 2015, and I would be with him when he lost his life at the Battle of Kana in 2035. Alexei Volobyov was prosecuted as a war criminal by the new Russian government, but his trial was never completed owing to the radical turn of events in 2015. He survived the war in heaven and passed away about 15 years ago in Russia. Ivan Kuznetsov avoided arrest by pledging loyalty to the new Russian Federation. He was more interested in raising his twin daughters than restoring the old Communist Party to power. He would attempt to murder his own daughter, Sofia, shortly after the fall of Earth. She would bring final justice to him 20 years later. Konstantin Volokov followed Kuznetsov's example, joining the new Russian Spetsnaz as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart. His status as an elite warrior put him in a prime position to survive the fall of Earth and establish the Reapers. While the current administration celebrates Volokov as some kind of hero, I intend to put a stop to such a behavior once I defeat Pascal Etienne and become the next Secretary General of the United Nations. Yutaka Yamamoto survived and lived in eastern Russia for the next 2 years. His betrayal and defection to the Soviet Union ended up being pointless. The USSR dissolved before he ever set foot in its territory, and he received none of the rewards he was promised. He would rejoin the Stormbreakers during the 2HW and see some degree of redemption before his death during the War in Heaven. To my utter amazement, Yukiko Takahashi also lived. After she received treatment for her gunshot wounds, she was deported to Russia and lived there until the Second Hyperspace War. In the 2040s, she established herself as Earth's foremost diplomat. I asked her why she charged at our squad mere seconds before the end of the war. She said, "I was being driven insane by my new gift. I could hear the thoughts of everybody around me, and I didn't know why or how. I was in torment, and I just wanted it to stop at any cost. So I ran at someone who was sure to kill me. I wasn't expecting to survive." As for the Stormbreakers themselves, Holly decided to remain in the British military, since she didn't have a family to go home to anymore. She was promoted to major and was soon in command of her own battalion of soldiers. About a year after Hiroshima, Holly decided to get the names of our fallen comrades tattooed on her back. Her living memorial has changed since then, but it remains her most defining feature. Soylent Green got out of the military and started attending a hospitality school in Perth, Australia. He continued pursuing his dreams of a restaurant empire with the same passion and intensity he chased skirts. His dream would eventually be realized about 3 decades later. Kotori left Japan and moved to America with Aaron Ray. Roughly a year and a half later, the two of them got married in a ceremony where Chihiro was the bridesmaid. Their one and only daughter carries the name of 2 of our lost friends, preserving their memories. Kate Asuna Ray would go on to become Jericho, the savior of mankind and beast slayer. Hal McIntosh returned to his home state of Ohio and became a police officer. From what I remember, he was actually good at his job. His patience and ability to work well under pressure certainly contributed to his survival over the next 20 years. Even though I was frightened for Tsubaki Endo when the ambulance drove away with her in the back, there was no real reason to worry, even though I wouldn't discover that until I sat down to write this book. Tsubaki's survival is the final revelation related to the paradox in this story. All of the evidence we found in her time ship, the Archangel, confirms beyond a shadow of a doubt that one of Akira's major goals in Hiroshima was to guarantee Tsubaki's survival. She used the alias of Nanako Yamada to position herself near Tsubaki, and made it possible to use her powers to preserve Tsubaki's life without being detected. Once Tsubaki was delivered into the care of a U.S. Army hospital, Nanako Yamada disappears from the historical record. Tsubaki's importance to history would become apparent 20 years later, when she served alongside myself and Jericho aboard the Triple Alliance starship Kakama during the Second Hyperspace War. I do remember that all of the surviving Stormbreakers were quite alarmed when Nanako disappeared. We even tried to find her, but those search efforts were laid aside when other problems began cropping up in 2015. Joshua Dennis Robinson vacated the U.S. presidency on January 20th, 2013. Alexis Alexander was sworn in on the same day, and my family returned to Michigan. But I didn't go with them. I chose to stay in Japan with Chihiro. The Endo family were true to their word and put us up in a nice place in the outskirts of Nagasaki on Kyushu Island. Chihiro and I were so grateful that I called my dad and told the entire story of my acquaintance with Tsubaki to him. After relaying how I'd grown to see the young girl as a comrade, my dad contacted some of his friends in the U.S. State Department and called in a few favors. 6 months after the war ended, Tsubaki found herself the proud owner of the finest prosthetic legs a human could have bought in those days. As for Chihiro and I, we lived in Nagasaki for 2 years. Just like the rest of our friends, it took a little time to adjust and return to civilian life. We actually needed therapy to cope with some of the things that happened to us. Chihiro and I were completely different people by 2013. She was no longer the bouncy, hyperactive person I'd met in the White House, and I'd picked up some of her act first, think later tendencies. As it turned out, we didn't really need to worry about finding work. My dad sent me a small allowance each month, and the Japanese government was reluctantly giving Chihiro a stipend for her military service. We probably could have eked out a meager existence like this, but then Tsubaki rocked the boat. A few months after the siege of Hiroshima, our youngest friend agreed to participate in some TV movie about the war. She embellished and exaggerated the role Chihiro and I played in the siege of Hiroshima. Tsubaki played us up to be larger-than-life heroes on Japanese national television. Soon enough, her story went global, and then everybody on Earth knew about the 6 heroes of Hiroshima. Soylent, Aaron, Holly, Kotori, Chihiro, and I suddenly became the heroes and deliverers of Japan during its finest hour. None of us could go anywhere or do anything without being mobbed by fans and supporters. We were adored by the entire world. Some of us enjoy the attention. I'm fairly certain it's not possible to count the number of girlfriends Soylent had during this period. Some of us were inconvenienced. Aaron and Kotori had to change their wedding venue at the last second when word got out that some 15,000 uninvited guests were planning to attend. And some of us had our quality of lives improved. Thanks to Tsubaki telling tall tales about us, the people of Japan learned that the humble young woman living with me in Nagasaki was really the former Princess Asami of Chiyako. They also learned that the Japanese government was planning to arrest her for illegally enlisting in the military. When Prime Minister Nakagawa's agents showed up at our apartment complex one morning in 2013, they found roughly 500 angry protesters blocking the way and were forced to back off. Nakagawa tried to gain the authority to have Chihiro arrested by calling for a snap election. I think his ploy was to increase the majority his party had in the National Diet. This maneuver backfired on him. Nakagawa's party was trounced in the elections nationwide, and was actually voted out of power on Kyushu Island and in Nagasaki itself, leaving Chihiro somewhat safe from prosecution. After that, Chihiro and I reluctantly decided to embrace the role of folk heroes that Tsubaki created for us. We showered our fans and supporters with gratitude and appreciation, and they, for the most part, responded by making sure that we wanted for nothing. We received so many donations that we had to start giving things away. Money came in the mail. Chihiro and I kept enough to keep our little household afloat and save for our wedding, and the rest was actually donated to various charities dedicated to rebuilding Japan. Most of the food people donated to us was similarly re-gifted to those who actually needed it. On the charity front, Tsubaki proved to be very helpful. She gave hundreds and eventually thousands of people instructions on how to support the charities Chihiro and I supported. The three of us actually made a fairly good team. Towards the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2015, the three of us had basically dedicated ourselves to helping with the reconstruction of Japan. While Chihiro wanted nothing to do with her old family, I kept in touch with my own. Jackie came to visit roughly twice a year so she could help plan my wedding with Chihiro, and my parents made it very clear that they expected front row seats on the big day. But what about the paradox? Well, the last time any of us ever saw Nanako Yamada was when she loaded Tsubaki and Yukiko onto that ambulance in Hiroshima. Hal told us that Nanako was able to stabilize Tsubaki before they arrived at the field hospital. According to Hal, Nanako jumped out of the back as soon as the vehicle stopped and said she was going to run into the hospital and alert the staff. Doctors and nurses came running into the parking lot to help Tsubaki and Yukiko, but Nanako herself never reappeared. Our team, the newly founded Stormbreakers, tried to search for her, but the war was over and military leadership was starting to send soldiers back home. Holly and Soylent went first, then Aaron went back to America, followed by Hal. We eventually had to contact the Japanese government and put the search in their hands. Nothing ever came up. Nanako Yamada simply ceased to exist once Akira Robinson no longer needed the alias. My daughter, my wife, my grandchild, and our friends were able to follow her trail on to the next time period. Akira recovered her time ship from a hangar in Matsuyama and departed Japan about a week after the war ended. She used the time core to jump directly from 2012 to 2015. She reappears in our timeline during the early morning hours of February 22nd, exactly 1 week before Operation Devil's Moon and the beginning of the invasion of Earth. In fact, that is the best place for me to end this book. It is by no means the end of the story. I cover my participation in the Second Hyperspace War quite extensively in one of my earlier books, The Stormbreakers. Nearly 2 centuries ago, a wise human once said that the story never ends. It goes on, even if certain people fall out of it. This is just where the purview of this particular book ends, with the ending of my own youth. So allow me to thank you for reading this most crucial and underreported story from the history of mankind, and allow me to further leave you with a narrative bridge that connects this story to that of the Stormbreakers. March 1st, 2015, Nagasaki, Japan. Chihiro woke me up at 4 in the morning, telling me to turn on the television. She said something was happening in Germany. Grumbling and groaning, I followed her into our little living room and clicked on the flat screen. Billowing smoke and flames rose up from the industrial sector of West Berlin, and a news reporter was talking about an unidentified flying object having crashed into the city. As Chihiro and I sat down in front of our TV, the news reporter carried on, saying that a team of unknown military operatives had flown into the area and engaged an enemy unknown. A graphic appeared on the screen, showing the photographs of 3 people, while the anchor said, "These are the identities of the soldiers who were killed in the violence in downtown Berlin this morning. As you can see, they were an unlikely group of people. What brought them together, and why were they gunned down in such a vicious way? More news in just a moment." And then 3 names appeared under the pictures. Private Vanya Volokov, Russian Army. Lance Corporal Sakura Ito, Japan Self-Defense Force. Sergeant Aaron Ray, United States Army. Chihiro and I dropped our jaws. We couldn't think of anything to say. How could we respond to the news that one of our old friends had been killed under mysterious circumstances halfway around the world? As the morning wore on, the news reporter was suddenly forced to cut away. There was another disruption taking place nearby that caught the news agency's attention. An Asian woman had been arrested in East Berlin after she was caught nailing a large warning sign to the front doors of the Reichstag, the very building that now serves as the capital of the United Nations. A news camera was able to catch the entire altercation. 2 German cops ran up the stairs and dragged the woman away, who was kicking and screaming. The giant poster she nailed to the door bore a handwritten message that said, "Warning! Aliens will attack unless we act now. They are not our friends." As the woman was dragged away by the German cops, one of the news reporters ran over to her with a microphone and said, "Fräulein, who are you? Why are you doing this?" The woman turned to the camera and screamed into the microphone, "Please, you've got to listen. My name is Anna Singh. I was abducted by aliens 3 days ago, and I've only just got away. They did horrible experiments on me. We've got to stop them. They've been studying us. They know our weaknesses. They're going to kill us all." Before Anna Singh could say another word, she was shoved headfirst into a police car and driven away. In front of our TV, Chihiro let out a low whistle and folded her arms. "Aliens, huh? Sounds like the script for a cheesy 90s movie," I said. "Totally ridiculous. What about that fight in the industrial sector, though? Where do you think Kotori is?" "Oh, she must be devastated," Chihiro sighed. "She was only married to Ray for like a year and a half. They're basically still in their honeymoon." "We should call her this morning," I offered. "I mean, when the sun actually comes up." "Yeah, I'll do that," Chihiro volunteered. "And could you keep an eye on the stuff happening in Berlin for me? Find out what happened?" "Sure thing," I said. "Maybe it'll turn into something interesting." This is McCavity 116. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of My Father's War, narrated by the author. This audio program was produced by the author, copyright 2024. My Father's War was written by McCavity 116, copyright 2021. XCOM Enemy Unknown was developed by Firaxis Games, copyright 2012. Command & Conquer Generals was developed by EA Games, copyright 2003. Wargame Red Dragon was developed by Eugen Systems, copyright 2014. The book The Kid Who Became President was written by Dan Gutman, copyright 1999.